What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 18 Week 10 quarterback rankings. If you guys like the video, hit that like button, subscribe. But let's just dive right into the tiers here. And starting off in tier 1, this is going to be the Lamar Jackson tier. He has been far and away the best fantasy quarterback this season, averaging over 25 points per game. He's the quarterback one in points per game by a decent margin. And he also has a really nice matchup here against the Bengals. They are top 6 in points per game allowed to the quarterback position. The Ravens also have the highest implied point total this week. So Lamar Jackson has obviously been balling. He also has a favorable matchup. Vegas expects this team to put up points. I think he is a very, very strong quarterback one play and has kind of separated himself from the pack at this point. Now, looking at tier 2, I have two guys in this tier. The first one is going to be Jalen Hurts, and he has been on an absolute tear over his last 4 games. In his last 4, he has put up 21 plus points in all 4 of them. And in his last 2, he has put up 35.1 and 29.9 points. This is also a favorable matchup here against the Cowboys, who are 5th in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. So Jalen Hurts, a very, very strong play this week. And then the other guy here in tier 2 is going to be Joe Burrow going up against the Ravens. He is coming off a 5-touchdown game. This is a favorable matchup here. The Bengals are 3rd in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. We know this is probably going to be a high-scoring game. The Bengals are going to have to keep up with the Ravens. Now, I will say, not ideal that T. Higgins is probably not going to play this week, but you still have Jamar Chase. Mike Gesicki out of nowhere is balling out. Chase Brown, weapon out of the backfield. I think in this matchup, Joe Burrow will still be fine, even if T. Higgins does not play. Now, moving into tier 3, still some very, very quality options here. The top half of the quarterback ones are definitely in a great place. We have Jaden Daniels going up against the Steelers. In his healthy games, he is averaging 22 points per game. This is just a tough matchup here against the Steelers. The Steelers have allowed the second fewest points per game to the quarterback spot. I still think Jaden Daniels is a very strong play, but he's just not quite up there in that top 3 where he normally is, just based on some favorable matchups for some other quarterbacks, and then his tough matchup this week. And then the other tier 3 quarterback, Josh Allen, he's been fairly consistent as of late, 19 plus points in each of his last 4 games. You're just hoping he gets Amari Cooper back and we can actually see Cooper, kind of fully integrated into this offense. Now, looking at tier 4, I have Brock Purdy, Sam Darnold, and Baker Mayfield. Purdy draws a nice matchup here against the Bucs. They've allowed the 2nd most points per game to the quarterback spot. He's also likely going to get Christian McCaffrey back, which I think is going to help the run game. Obviously a weapon out of the backfield and just take some pressure off of Brock Purdy back there. So with the matchup, the return of CMC, I think he's a nice mid-tier QB1 play. Also have Sam Darnold with a favorable matchup. The Jaguars have allowed the most points per game to the quarterback position, and he's been pretty consistent, 14 plus points in 7 of 8 games. I believe he's at 16 plus in 6 of 8, so he's been a very steady option. I think the nice matchup here makes him a fun play. Plus TJ Hawkinson, second game back, should continue to work his way into this offense. And then a guy who does not have a good matchup here, Baker Mayfield, going up against the 49ers. And I've been someone pretty much every week. I've said I've been too low on Baker. I consistently have slept on this dude. And I did it again last week. It was a tough matchup against the Chiefs. He didn't necessarily have a nuclear game, but he still produced. He has put up 18 plus points in 8 out of 9 games. He is the quarterback 2 in points per game. So even in a not so great matchup with the 49ers off the bye, without his top weapons in Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, I think at this point, Baker does deserve the respect and, should be put in a spot where you'd feel decent about starting him. Now, moving into a very, very large tier 5, it's really tough to differentiate between these dudes. A lot of them are pocket passers. A lot of them don't have great matchups here. I'm going to start off this tier with Jared Goff, and he has a somewhat nice matchup here. The Texans are top 10 in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. The Lions are expected to put up points. They are 3rd in implied points. Jared Goff has been a pretty solid option. Even if the passing volume hasn't been there consistently, I still like him as a back-end QB1. Then I have Matthew Stafford going up against the Dolphins. Now, this is not a good matchup here for Stafford. The Dolphins have allowed the 3rd fewest points per game to the quarterback spot, but in his last 2 games, since getting Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua back, Stafford has put up 24.8 and 17.9 points. And that, week 9 game, he really didn't even have Puka for over half the game. So with those guys back, I think he's going to be a nice play, even in a tough matchup. Then I have Kyler Murray going up against the Jets. And this is tough because I thought Kyler was a fine play, even with the tough matchup last week against the Bears. He went out, had by far his worst game of the season, was a complete dud in your lineup. And now he draws another tough matchup here against the Jets, who have allowed the fourth fewest points per game to the quarterback spot. So I still think Kyler has the ability to be a solid play. He has a fairly high ceiling due to his rushing upside, but it is tough because he's just coming off a really rough performance in week 9. After Kyler, going to go with Patrick Mahomes going up against the Broncos. Now, his last 2 games have been his best 2 for fantasy, but he does draw a pretty tough matchup here against the Broncos. Like going from the Bucs to the Broncos is a pretty significant difference. They are bottom 6 in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. So I still think he's playable as like a fringe QB1, but I don't think he's like an auto lock just because he had, his first big game of the season. Then after Mahomes, you're going to go with Aaron Rodgers taking on the Cardinals. In his last 2, seems like this offense is starting to figure some things out. He's put up 17.3 and 20.3 points. The ceiling isn't going to be super high just based on the lack of rushing upside, but it's a fine matchup here. Garrett Wilson's been balling. Devontae Adams had his first breakout game. I think he firmly belongs within this tier. And then after Rodgers, going to go with another veteran here, Kirk Cousins going up against the Saints. Now, the Saints haven't been a great matchup for opposing quarterbacks. I believe they're bottom 10 in points per game allowed, but it does seem like this team's kind of fallen apart. They traded Lattimore. That's obviously going to be a plus for Kirk Cousins. The one thing I will say just to monitor is the Drake London hip injury. If London is out, I would probably bump Kirk, down at least a few spots, probably into tier 6. So something to look out for. This is going to be assuming that Drake London is good to go. Then after Kirk, going to go with Tua going up against the Rams. In his 3 full games, he's put up 18.6, 14.7, and 17.5 points. Solid, fairly consistent. There's just not a ton of upside with Tua. And then he doesn't necessarily have like a smash matchup here going up against the Rams. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Justin Herbert. I really liked Herbert heading into the season. I think from a real-life perspective, Justin Herbert is a locked-in top 5 quarterback. In an offense that doesn't have great weapons, they were super run-heavy early on. He has been so impressive. Fantasy-wise, it's not going to translate as much because he doesn't have a ton of rushing upside with his legs. The passing numbers aren't going to be super gaudy just based on who he's throwing to. But his last 2 games have been his best 2. He has thrown for 275-plus yards in each of the last 3 games. So the passing volume is starting to be there. You have Quentin Johnston having a big game. Ladd McConkey looks like he's breaking out. Definitely someone who I do think could be a fun play rest of season. But this week, more of like a higher end QB2 going up against the Titans. Not a great or terrible matchup. And then the final tier here, tier 6, definitely guys that I still think could potentially be playable. The first one is going to be Daniel Jones. Week 9 was by far his best game of the season. I believe he had 2 passing touchdowns, had a lot of rushing production in there. And then this matchup is just very favorable. The Panthers have allowed the 4th most points per game to the quarterback spot. So it could be the opportunity to play Daniel Jones here if you are desperate. And then the last guy here, CJ Stroud, going up against the Lions. This is going to be assuming that he gets Nico Collins back. So Nico Collins, Tank Dell at wide receiver. The offensive line is still going to be brutal, but I think he can deal with it if he does have Nico Collins. And then an honorable mention to Bo Nix going up against the Chiefs. It's not a great matchup, but Bo Nix has been a pretty solid option over the last 4 or 5 games. I do think you could do worse than him at the quarterback spot. But that's going to wrap it up for my top 18. If you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. Stay tuned. I will also have my tight end rankings out today. But thank you again for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.